This is dedicated to the first ever massacre the United States has committed in Puerto Rico in the early 1930s, when they committed a massacre against university students in the most prestigious university in Puerto Rico, the University of Puerto Rico in Rio Piedras. Marxists-Leninists unite. Puerto Rico, a call for independence. In the Americans, there is only one market, one imperialist power. All the economies are geared to the needs of the USNA imperialist class. This is the material base for the development hemispheric revolution, which will overthrow our common oppressor. Thus our crucial task to win the peasant masses of South America at the research of the Anglo-American proletarian. Unlike the CPUSA, we know that all radical phrasmongery about national liberation in the general is chauvinistic demagogy, without determined struggle in support for the liberation struggle of the colonies of Puerto Rico and the Negro nation for their independence from the US imperialism. Puerto Rico has been direct colony of USNA imperialism since 1998. It has suffered imperialist oppression during that whole period, has fought back valiantly. The Puerto Rico Nation Liberation Movement strike in the same enemy which also opposed proletarian revolution in Anglo-America, the USNA imperialism. Puerto Rico, as a colony of USNA imperialism, serves imperialism, but we must change this situation, and Puerto Rico must become a reserve of the Anglo-American proletarian revolution. For without it, we cannot succeed here. The dialectics of the situation demand also that we become the reliable support of the Puerto Rican national liberation movement. Only by marching together in one unbroken line can the Puerto Rican proletarian and the peasantry of the Anglo-American proletarian advance towards socialism. The 40s represented the departure point for the reorganization of Puerto Rico's social force. The crisis of the 30s in the US has the effect of the colony which Puerto Rico was and continues to, and end for the independent struggle being waged. Puerto Rico suffered the devastating effects of this crisis. The broad impoverished masses in Puerto Rico, cornered by the crisis and lacking a real revolutionary Communist Party, began to rally around the Nationalist Party, whose highest leader was Pedro Albizu Campos. This was the time in which the Nationalist Party had extraordinary absurd among the wide sectors of the people, which in turn served as a basis for the many protests which took place in the factories, schools, communities, and towns of the island during that time. The inability of the Nationalist Party to put into effect a mass policy which would set forth an effective solution for the working masses permitted imperialism to channel its politics of aggression through the creation of the Popular Democratic Party, the Popular, and the PPD, whose highest leader was Luis Muñoz Marin, the son of Luis Muñoz Rivera, was the imperialist instrument through which a pale reformism not only succeeded in monetarily quieting down the Puerto Rican anti-imperialist movement, but also served for 30 years and still served to put imperialist politics in Puerto Rico into effect. Imperialism promotes the creation of the PPT, not to present the interests of the toiling masses, but to quiet down the cries of protest. In this sense, we could not have expected anything different. As early as the colonial elections in 1944, in which the PPT was overwhelmingly victorious, but the party began to fully expose itself as an instrument of imperialism. When they realized what this situation was, those elements of the Puerto Rican national bourgeois who had close ranks within the PPT, formed their own political party to continue the struggle for independence of Puerto Rico. In this way, the Puerto Rican Independence Party arose. The Nationalist Party, which represents the most radical section of the national bourgeois, had been crushed by the imperialists towards the end of the 1930s, and its leadership assassinated or jailed together with its leading figure, Pedro Albizu Campos. The new bourgeois literature which went on the lead to the independent movement did not have the strength nor the radical anti-imperialist character of the Nationalist Party. This is the result of a new attack which imperialism unleashed against our country. During the first decade of the century, North American capital spilled into the agricultural base of the country and proletarianized the countryside. And then, after the Second World War, launched its attack by exporting industrial capital in Puerto Rico. The industrialization process is the process by which imperialism definitively smashed the Puerto Rican national bourgeois convert in the fields in which it is still allowed to operate into a junior partner in the exploitation of the brown working masses. So imperialism forms through this avalanche of financial and industrial capital. A Puerto Rico with a numerous working class and a Puerto Rico with immediate capitalist relation of production. The uprising of the 30th of October 1950, promoted by the Nationalist Party, was the last armed attempt to take power made by the remnants of the national bourgeois. This uprising was a desperate but useless attempt with no possibility of success, for it marked the first attempt against North American imperialism in the history of Puerto Rico. Many patriotic enemies died in the attempt, and some, together with those who carried out the attack on the U.S. Congress, was also promoted by the Nationalist Party and still today imprisoned in the USNA. The struggle for the independence of Puerto Rico was broken down in the 50s by these events. It was for Puerto Rico a period of reorganization of social forces given the avalanche of junky financial and industrial capital toward the end of the 50s, especially in 1959. The pro-independence movement was founded. There then arose a phenomenon new to the independence struggle. The petty bourgeois arrived on the political stage to lead the independence of the international struggle of the Algerian Revolution and the one that affected its core, the Cuban Revolution. This new situation has been called the new independence struggle. The organization of the Puerto Rico workers during the whole period of the 50s fell into the claws of North American unions, which are nothing but imperialist instruments. It is important to point out that during the 1950s, more than half of a million Puerto Ricans driven by hunger and poverty migrated to the United States, precisely New York. It was then that MPI took the reign to lead the independence struggle. In essence, the struggle came to led by the petty bourgeois. This process took place together with the new economic development on a worldwide scale, the crisis of capitalism, and the war of Vietnam. The broad Puerto Rican laboring masses began to feel the weight of the economic crisis, and the class struggle began to sharpen. The cadre within the MPI, who realized the petty bourgeois direction of its policies, and other communist cadre began to propose the creation and construction of a party and worker class at the imminent task of the Puerto Rico revolutionary process. The PIP, which suffered an electoral disaster, reorganized itself on a new basis, a petty bourgeois basis. The petty bourgeois organized around these two parties, the PSP, MFI, and the PIP. Also felt the weight of the economic crisis and answered by putting on socialist clothing, but which at heart was and is revisionism and petty bourgeois ideology. In order to win the brown working masses to their side, the economic crisis which is hitting Puerto Rico through imperialism had little by little dethroned a fascist type of government which fought against independence, workers, and students' movement in various ways. The repression unleashed against organizations such as Proletariat Cause, which was broken up by, and the Socialist Revolutionary Party ML, are the most recent examples of this situation. Also are the repression against workers on strike, like the General Electric strike, the El Mundo newspaper strike, the telephone strike. The situation of repression is one of the most important aspects of Puerto Rico today, but the most important aspect about which the broad working masses unite is the high cost of living. The rise in the cost of living is an imperialist form of making the cost of its aggressive wars, like the Vietnam War and its armed races, fall off shoulders of the working people. Note, even every war the United States has come, Puerto Ricans are always go first in the battlefield before any white man. The wage freeze together with the rising prices is in fact an underhanded way of reducing workers' wage and increase the capitalist surplus value and the marginal exploitation. The petroleum superport which they are trying to build in Puerto Rico to solve the U.S. petroleum crisis is a form to try to increase the degree of imperialist domination over our country even more. We struggle against such plans. The summary. The independence struggle in Puerto Rico is today headed in a firmer path. The principal task of the creation of the construction of a party to the working class base of Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought have begun by the Socialist Revolutionary Marxist-Leninists. The great working masses began to get out of the sphere of the Yankee syndicalism, where they have been imprisoned for more than 40 years. The struggle against the state of repression unleashed against the state of the oppression unleashed by imperialism is beginning to bear fruit. The struggle against petty bourgeois ideology and the contemporary revisionism represent in Puerto Rico by the PSP-MPI is being carried out by the most conscious communist elements. The struggle for independent socialism in Puerto Rico and the struggle against imperialism both in Puerto Rico and in the USNA is and will be arduous. No struggle away for working classes against their common enemy, the US imperialism, and therefore the closest union between both bases on that proletariat internationalism, which has led the international proletariat to great victories, is required. The above report, as represented to the conference by the Socialist Revolutionary Party of Puerto Rico, it was unanimously accepted. In addition, an introduction was added to demonstrate the need for the Anglo-American working class to militantly show their support by demanding concretely independence for Puerto Rico. During the workshop, two main deviations were also discussed of the question of Puerto Rico, which will be summarized here. The primary deviation of the Puerto Rican national colonial question is white chauvinism, and the secondary is bourgeois nationalism. This white chauvinism expressed toward Puerto Rico by the Anglo-American so-called revolutionary is the line that main profits the US and the imperialists are made there of the Anglo-American working class and not of the colonies. This white chauvinist lie, put forth mainly by the CPUSA and their conciliators, denigrate the importance of the national question and break the links between the working class and the oppressed people. Thus, it is the major task for Anglo-American revolutionaries to explain to their own working class they cannot be free without independence for Puerto Rico, a task that CPUSA and the conciliators had never done. The CPUSA claimed to support the liberation of Puerto Rico, but in fact it dealt in severe blow in 1949 when it liquidated all communist work in Puerto Rico, along with that of the Negro Nation during the CPUSA support the original PSP and its tiny partner in crime, the CP of Puerto Rico. The CPUSA also pushed the syndicalist line that national minorities are not part of the Anglo-American working class in the liberation struggle are separate from the proletariat revolution. This is a theoretical justification for the Communist Party USA fight to divide the working class to render it unable to perform its historical mission, the liberation of all of humanity. The other secondary deviation is that of the bourgeois nationalism, the main advocate of which is the PSP, the Puerto Rican Socialist Party. Formerly the MPI, their bourgeois nationalism disguised as Marxist-Leninism is quite different from the militant nationalism of the Nationalist Party of Albizu Campos. The PSP position is basically reformism and reduces itself to two main theses, the divine nation and the true state theory. The divine nation theory said that Puerto Rico nation exists both in the island and in the location of the Anglo-American nation, in which lived the large concentration of Puerto Ricans, particularly in the ghettos of New York, Chicago, and Boston. To deny that a nation rests in a common territory, to deny the nation itself, and fall into the natural cultural autonomy of Springer and Boer. The true state theory calls for a period of an independent bourgeois republic, while new democracy is essentially in a semi-feudal country. Puerto Rico is overwhelmingly industrial, and even the vast majority of the rural toilers are proletarian. This position on no socialism now represent the attempt by the petty bourgeois revolutionary to use the working class to defeat the imperialists and to deny the proletariat state power and maintain capitalism within the petty bourgeois in control. This can only lead to the continued hegemony of the USNA imperialists. The Anglo-American proletariat must fight for the independence for Puerto Rico, or for equality for the national minority, as the only way to unite the working class and turn the reserves of the bourgeois into reserves of the proletarian.